Alright y'all, welcome back to Come to Arms channel. Okay, so today we're checking out a video from Johnny Harris. Now this one is all about basically how much the US military spends. So basically how much the US spends on its defense. And I already know it's a lot. I mean, kind of just being in the US military, especially in like the Army and the Marines, I kind of understand like how massive of a, I mean, they say like the military industrial complex or whatever. Like that's definitely a thing. And you kind of see it, especially when you start to realize how much things actually cost in the military. So I'm pretty excited to see this breakdown. Again, he always does some really solid research. So I think for the most part, it's going to be pretty accurate. And hopefully I can just provide some insight as to kind of what I see just being in the U.S. military myself. But should be cool. Let's check it out.
Let me show you how much the United States
That's a pretty
spends
hype
on
intro.
its military. Over here you've got Russia, China, India, and other big military powers. And yet, if you combine them all into one, the US still spends more. More than the next 10 countries combined. But I'm interested in what happens
billion
inside of this circle. Like,
That's
what
just
are
so
we
hard to
spending
fathom.
our money on?
Oh, he's got the receipts, huh?
In here, we'll see everything that the military spends their money on, from salaries for soldiers.
I will say, like, for the most part, like, you can pretty much go online and see what the U.S. military is spending their money on. Obviously, it's not going to go into the nitty gritty, especially for some of the more, like, classified programs. But, like, you still have different pots of money that it'll kind of show. So, as far as the research, I imagine it's still going to be pretty much spot on.
To elementary schools for their children. We'll see the $21 million helicopters and these missiles that cost $1.6 million each. And we'll see how much the Pentagon spends on the development of new weapons, new technology, like these ship-based laser weapons.
Oh, research and development. I'm trying not to pause it too much, but research and development, like, I've seen a lot of really interesting kind of projects, but I've also seen, like, some start, get a lot of funding, and then the military's just like, yeah, this kind of sucks, or it's not really what we wanted, or we found this other thing that we're funding that just works better. So, like, yeah. And that's just, you know, the nature of the beast. Research and development is always going to be a very expensive thing. And it's also worth noting, which is why, like, China specifically spends a lot of resources just trying to steal research and development, kind of steal that information, because you can save a lot of money if, like, we spend billions and billions on developing this F-35. If somebody can just steal all the information and not do any of the research and development themselves, then obviously they're getting a pretty good bargain.
$2 trillion. We even made a little model of this guy. And like the real thing, the model is continually breaking down.
No. So they made a model of themselves?
Yeah. Of all the money our Congress budgets to run our government on any given year, almost half of it goes to the military. Here you've got education, and there's diplomacy, and health science,
crazy to
energy, environment. We've been deep in the spreadsheets and the data.
And another 7% was veterans benefits.
Public and open to scrutiny, with the goal of visualizing all of this, trying to understand where the money goes, to understand why the U.S. spends so much more than any other country on its military. And most important of all, to try to answer the question of whether all of this money actually makes us safer.
Almost all of our witnesses before the Armed Services Committee tell us that we are in the most dangerous global threat security since generations.
It's going to be hard to kind of judge if it's like putting in a good effect, mostly because a lot of it is deterrence.
For 2023. It's how they planned to spend money that year. It turns out that how much they spend on defense is pretty complicated and depends a lot on who you ask. So go to the sources, you can see how we got all these numbers and what decisions we made. The total number we got was $853 billion. That's more than the entire economy of Switzerland. Let's take a brain break because I want to talk about another kind
I wonder what the US GDP
an annoying
is
part
then.
of my personal budget, which is subscriptions. You know what I'm talking about.
I mean, I guess
we all
probably
subscribe
like
to things
2
that
trillion
every month charge
judging
us
by
a
the
little
math
bit
you
of
were saying
money, not
before.
enough for us to pay attention to it, but enough to add up over time. There's a lot of companies whose main business model is hoping that you'll sign up for
appreciate
something
him doing,
and
like,
then
the little
forget that you signed up so that they
thing
can
on the
charge
bottom.
you every month. This is super.
Right there.
The link, then Rocket Money
Appreciate
won't know
that.
if you found them through this, and that's like pretty important to running the business here and doing these videos. Okay, now that I've been talking about my personal budget, let's get back to the budget of the military of the United States.
Haven't seen somebody wear a
lot.
striped
So
shirt
let's
in a
start
minute.
to break it down.
Weird comment. Doesn't look bad, I guess.
Close to half of all of this money goes to the vague-sounding category of operations and maintenance. This is $352 billion that we spend just on O&M. That's like larger than the entire economy of Portugal. Like, just to create the report, to get all these numbers assembled in one place, costs the DoD $269,000. But also,
That's funny.
credit to the Pentagon and the U.S. government
Golly.
for giving us all of this very clear data that we can shine a light on and
I
scrutinize.
mean, that's transparency. It's
lot
a
of
price of
countries aren't this
transparency, I
transparent.
guess.
So anyway, operations and
Jeez.
maintenance. This is like all the costs required to keep the Department of Defense, one of the largest organizations in the world, running. It's a lot of not very sexy stuff like transportation, fuel, maintenance of equipment, administrative costs, training expenses.
Oh, and training. I
includes-
mean, if you're just talking about training alone, like, I can see how that adds up. I mean, for example, for me right now, I am in training, and it's a little over 2 months. But with this training specifically, every student, every warrant officer who goes here goes into a hotel. So you have to think, paying for a hotel room for, a little over 2 months. I think it was like roughly $7,000 just for the hotel, just for me. And obviously there's, a lot of other warrant officers here. That's just one small school, and there's schools happening constantly. I mean, there's numerous. So there's a lot of expenses just talking about that, not to mention like my rental car and things like that. So yeah, that can add up a lot. And we're not even talking about like special forces and the kind of training that they do.
$39 billion just for the doctors and health services for active duty personnel. And it also covers the stuff that you don't really think about when you think of military
That
spending,
makes sense.
like
It's
environmental
a lot of people,
cleanup
too.
in areas that the military has left unexploded bombs or spilled chemicals
Damn.
in the local environment. It also
lot.
includes disaster relief and humanitarian money, which is something the military does as well. Here's nearly $1 billion
They do a lot with that,
dedicated to
especially
anti-drug
the National Guard.
activities. And here's $10 million for security at international sporting competitions. This huge category also captures the cost to run every one of the U.S.'s approximately
I wonder what an example of that is.
1,250 military bases, including the approximately 800 bases that are not in the United States, that are in other countries, which, by the way, are quite expensive to run because the U.S. military
Yeah.
has basically created a slice of America in these other countries. You've got Pizza Hut and McDonald's and Subway and grocery.
So he's showing a lot of stuff like in kind of non-permissive environments, like in a deployed environment, like, Iraq, Afghanistan, sure. But I mean, with a lot of those bases as well, I mean, consider like a base in Germany or like Belgium. I mean, there's a lot that the local populace, the nation itself gets. Because if you look at any kind of base inside the U.S., around that base, there's a lot of like urban sprawl and build up, and it's usually pretty solid as far as like the amount of stuff you can find around the base, because you get so much influx of money because of those troops and whatnot. And the same kind of happens overseas. So those businesses around those U.S. military bases also get a pretty good chunk of change. Like with Belgium, for example, there's not even housing for like officers and whatnot. There's no like on base housing that they would go to. So instead they just rent houses in the country itself. So they just find, Belgian nationals who are renting their houses out, and they just rent their houses. So it's a pretty interesting relationship.
Stores with products flown from the United States to make military personnel serving abroad feel like they're right at home. Okay, but let's just pause right here on this map, because this is a good moment to recognize that the United States military is not a normal army. It is not a normal military. Most militaries are tasked with protecting their country, securing their borders. But the US military is so much more than that. It sprawls out throughout the entire globe, giving the US control over every corner of the planet, allowing the US to be the global policeman.
Not that
where it
control,
enforces
maybe like
the rules and
influence.
norms of the system that it created and from which it benefits immensely. So, one quick answer to this big
Biased,
question of
I
why
guess,
the United
opinion
States spends
or
so
wording.
much more on its military is actually pretty simple, because this is the cost of being the global hegemon, the one who gets to enforce the rules and maintain control over the globe.
Hey, the international good guy is kind of the way we
but let's
see
keep
it,
going
but
on our budget. That's the point of the video.
again, it's subjective, but I think we do a lot of really incredible stuff.
The next big category here is people, military personnel. $172 billion.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Pay, benefits, retirement, healthcare for the over 3.4 million soldiers, reservists, and civilian military personnel. By some estimates,
So he said retirement, but I noticed that when he did the breakdown, there's also a separate thing for the VA. But maybe technically, since they're retirees, because if you're a retiree, technically you're still like bound by like the Uniform Code of Military Justice and whatnot. So maybe they just have a separate pot of money that's still attached to the U.S. military for those retirees, but veterans themselves are kind of seen differently or paid differently at least, which makes sense. And yeah, the U.S. military gets paid pretty well. I mean, when I was like a private lance corporal, it seemed like it was still fine. It was enough for me because I didn't really have any obligations, and I was also living in the barracks. But now as like a warrant officer one, I mean, you can go online and you can look at the pay grade for, like, for example, for me, a warrant officer one who's been in for over 12 years, you can look how much, there's actually calculators to show you how much the base pay would be. Obviously, that's like, you know, before taxes and whatnots. But like, you can pretty easily ascertain how much somebody gets a month based on their housing allowance, their, you know, sustenance allowance, and then their base pay and stuff.
the Department of Defense is the largest employer in the world, though it depends on how you count it. The Pentagon also spends a lot of money on recruiting new talent, like the $28 million that they spent on hiring experts who work in artificial intelligence.
They do a shitty job at that sometimes, though. Like the Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson thing.
Next, the military spends $140 billion on research and development. And a reminder, I know that these numbers are abstract and billion doesn't mean anything to anyone, but like $140 billion, that's the entire economy of Morocco that the Pentagon spends on R&D.
That doesn't help, to be honest. Like, I don't know much about Morocco,
maintaining technological superiority on the battlefield. Meaning they're working on new tech. It's a huge part of what the Pentagon does. Now, a lot of this stuff is classified, but we do know that the Pentagon is spending money on stuff like AI, using AI to analyze drone footage to improve their targeting capabilities, building autonomous submarines, or these insane military lasers that they use at sea to attack other ships.
Those
For
lasers
years, they've also been trying
pretty freaking cool, and a lot of them are kind of like counter UAS stuff as well. I'll try not to pause it too much. I know I'm not doing a good job at that, but yeah, like, so the military, they'll kind of award contracts differently depending on, like, you know, certain phases and stuff. But I mean, you can see, like, even if it's just like a company that's trying to kind of pitch their idea to the military, they might just be like, you know what, we kind of believe in you, even though you're like 5 people in a garage or less sometimes. Here's like $1 million to kind of work towards kind of what we want to see, or how we want to use that stuff.
Develop this exoskeleton that will supercharge the abilities of their soldiers, allow them to carry more weight over long periods of time. Although this technology, while potentially promising, isn't really there yet.
Come
but
eventually,
it might be soon. Now, the Pentagon pours a lot of investment into these technologies for the battlefield. But sometimes this tech actually turns into stuff that we use every day, like GPS, drones, voice recognition, the computer mouse, and the internet itself are all technologies that were first developed, at least in part, by the U.S. military.
Yep. The World Wide Web, or the web, was created for and by the United States Department of Defense.
That's so crazy to think about.
Let's quickly look at this smallest of the categories, still $19 billion.
Changing the world.
But compared to all these other ones, it's pretty small. This is construction, building new facilities, both at home and abroad. Like this little project, $85 million.
Need to fix up a lot of those barracks. This hotel Wi-Fi is not great, I'll be honest. I'm kind of risking it all, just trying to throw it into 1080p.
Or jet fuel tanks in Japan, supporting force projection in the Pacific. Or it looks like they're proposing $75 million to spend on a new operations support facility in Southern California.
Oh, but that's a special operations forces. So.
And finally, we get to the part
like
of the budget
new
that
training
you probably think about when you think of military
something.
spending. Procurement. $167 billion, the entire economy of Ethiopia, to purchase all of this.
I'm curious what this is gonna look like as far as the breakdown?
Okay, I've always known the military stuff is expensive,
Especially
but
separate
now
from
I really
research
know
and
it. Let's look
development.
at some of this stuff.
Oh, okay, I see.
This jet costs around $142
The rate of
million.
fire on that thing.
The U.S. bought 77 of them in 2023 and is asking for another $14 billion to buy 83 more this year.
That makes me
And they're
sweat
pretty
just
spendy
looking
to
at it.
fly too. Look
Flying
at these
for
4
30
cruise
minutes.
missiles parachuting out of a plane.
Someone's like annual allowance.
Each one of these missiles costs $1.6 million.
That's a lot
Oh,
of
and the American
sixes.
taxpayer bought 600 of them last year.
Oh, dude, what the heck?
This
I didn't see
vehicle
it
costs
from.
$372,000.
I've never seen it shoot from there. That's
It's
crazy.
used to move troops around the battlefield. Last year we bought about 3,700 of them, and this year we want another 3,100. $2.8 billion buying 24 of
seems
these
pretty cool.
F-15s. For the Navy, this is going to cost $7.3 billion. $1.2 billion for these 56.
I mean, you're talking about a Virginia class submarine. Like, that is a very kind of strategic sort of thing. A lot of militaries don't even have submarines. And Virginia class, when you're talking about that, like the Tomahawk capabilities with those specifically is pretty important. As far as having that ability to deploy those types of munitions from, I mean, basically anywhere in the world, kind of just going on the sea. And again, it's a nuclear submarine, so that thing can go for like 20 years or something. And, you know, I'm going to have to Google if that was a well-known metric or not, to be honest. But yeah, those things can go forever. I mean, you have a nuclear reactor, that thing's going to go forever, and it doesn't need to, like, refuel or anything, obviously.
Black Hawk helicopters for the Army. $8.2 billion for 3 destroyer-class ships. Probably doing the same thing with those submarines. Fleet replenishment, American-class amphibious assault ship.
I was tripping. I was like, I played it again, and I was like, why do I feel like I'm hearing like 3?
$2 billion. I mean, it's a lot. And these are just a few tiny little samples. I'm just scratching the surface. And in fact, this diagram that looks so complex and granular is also highly simplified and condensed. Each one of these categories actually contains billions of tiny little things inside it.
Golly, I want to see their
This
like
organization
breakdown if
is
they
much
have like
bigger than we could ever
that
fathom.
in a PDF or
And
something.
in fact, it's much bigger than the Pentagon itself can even fathom.
The Pentagon has, up until this point in 2024, never successfully passed an audit. American taxpayers want to know how our tax dollars are getting spent, and the fact that
I wonder
the
how accurate you need to
department
be
that's getting such a huge
percentage-wise.
chunk of the federal budget can't account for all of the dollars it's getting is
Because if it's not
definitely a problem.
percentage-wise,
For 6 years
if it's
in
just
a row
like a
now,
dollar
the Pentagon
amount,
has failed to pass an independent
that's a lot of money,
audit.
though.
They've brought in a bunch of accountants and said, tell us where all of our stuff is and what we spend our money on. And the accountants say, no, we can't do it. 61% of their physical assets are missing. They don't know where they are, which means they're probably investing a lot of money in stuff that they already have and they just don't know it. But my bigger question here is why?
leaving
The
like
United States pulled
subscriptions
out of
on and then getting
Afghanistan a few
charged
years
and not
ago.
realizing
the
it.
war in Iraq is over, but spending continues to go up. And spending went down for like a split second, but look, it's going up.
I mean, when we were stuck in like the global war on terror, you have to think like we kind of knew what our adversary was. We had like a target set. We knew kind of what we needed to develop in order to counter like IEDs and such. But now we're focusing more on like peer-to-peer warfare. So talking about, you know, Russia and China, Iran, kind of preparing ourselves. And now it's just kind of us trying to, it's just like a pacing battle right now of who can be the most technologically advanced. So while we're developing things, China is also developing things, but they're also stealing a lot of our information. So yeah, it's kind of just us trying to outpace, and it's just going to get more expensive. And now that we're kind of past the global war on terror, that's kind of the focus. So it makes a little bit more sense for me, but I'm sure there's also a lot of other things that I'm not considering.
Again. Okay, well, first off, remember what we talked about earlier. The US is not a normal country with a regular military. The US is the global hegemon who uses its military to assert control and order over every corner of the globe. But there's another reason why this budget is so high. And this reason is much more infuriating to me.
Contracts.
What our little graph here doesn't reveal is that most of this money is going to private corporations who get 466 billion of these dollars. About
You want a
54%.
screw? That's going to be
again, the U.S.
$1,000.
government tells us exactly which corporations they give all this money to. We pulled the last 19 years worth of data
It's
on
pretty.
these private contractors.
It's pretty wild.
At the top of this list, you start to see the same names over and over. Raytheon, General Dynamics, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin. These are the names at the top of these lists, year after year. There used to be a lot.
Oh, they're going to be
different
staying
defense
there for a minute, huh?
But over the last 3 decades, they got gobbled up by these big 5. Transitioning, from the
Interesting.
words of the Pentagon, from 51 to 5 aerospace and defense prime contractors.
Whoa, okay.
As a result, the DoD is increasingly reliant on a small number of contractors for critical defense
Oh my gosh, that's
capabilities.
crazy. I didn't know it was that
i.e.
bad.
We've got kind of a monopoly issue on our hands.
Yeah.
These 5 contractors own the space.
Let's
And
see
the
who's gonna
Pentagon
come out
can't
on
really
top,
go
basically.
elsewhere if they need an F-35. There's only one shop in town that makes it. For this reason, the prices can get pretty out of control.
One
Like the
shop
Pentagon
in
used to pay
town.
$25,000 for this Stinger missile, and now they pay nearly $500,000 for the same missile. The price went up more than 16 times.
I mean, I know inflation's a
in
thing,
just a
but-
couple decades. It's a little more than inflation.
There's a history of defense contractors
Damn.
overcharging the U.S. government. They can overcharge. If they're the only company producing a certain widget, then
Whoa.
there's no competition. And that's one of the problems with monopoly, is if there's not competition, it's easy to overcharge the buyer. In addition, the Inspector General...
I remember when we were guarding the nuclear submarines, we were driving around in our Bearcat, like the SWAT truck. And I don't know, it was late at night. My driver was fucking around or something. But he hit some like metal part. Literally just like, I don't know, maybe like 6 feet wide or something. Just looked like a metal disc. And it's like steel and stuff. So it's like, yeah, okay, it's probably fine. And then I guess there was some chief from the submarine who found out about this. But he was like complaining because that part was like tens of thousands of dollars. And it was literally just, I shit you not, like a 6-foot disc, like metal steel disc. I don't know. It was pretty wild, but he was trying to get us in trouble for it. I don't know if it got damaged or anything, but that was like, I was like, for that thing, like,
of the Department
we'll
of Defense
remake it or
has
something.
found routinely that there's overcharging through corruption and waste and fraud. And there have been lawsuits. For example, KBR is a contractor that's been used overseas,
Oh my God.
and they were found to overcharge in
KBR.
dining halls by 30 to 40%.
It's also why a Pentagon
They were
inspector
pretty
realized
infamous. I
that
remember hearing
the
about
Pentagon
that.
was paying Boeing, yes, that Boeing, $3,357 for one ball bearing, a small little piece that the Pentagon could actually get for $15 in their own warehouse. $15.42 to be precise. When the Pentagon does get around to investigating these
Yikes.
contractors, they sometimes find that
I mean,
they're
just talk about the
taking
materials and
huge profits,
machining.
like
I know there's
40 to 50% profit margins, giving them
development and stuff,
hundreds and
but-
millions of dollars above what they should be making in any kind of typical business environment. And what do they do with all these profits? Well, they pay their executives very well. But this list also tells us what they do. This is a list of how much money these defense contractors spend to influence our lawmakers into spending more money
okay.
on the military so
Interesting.
that these companies can make more money. You can see right here that Lockheed Martin is at the top of the list. So far this year, in this election cycle, Lockheed
That's
Martin has
a
spent
lot less than I thought.
$2.7 million, split pretty
honest.
evenly between Democrats and Republicans. This is a number that will continue to go up as we get closer to the election, and it is money spent to cozy up to lawmakers on both sides.
So that's one thing, but I mean, you also have to think there's probably a lot of other kind of money moving around for people who can kind of get in on, you know, some of those profits, obviously, kind of, you know, hey, I'm in this position and I can kind of influence that, whatever, this specific company get a contract for this laser system as opposed to this other one. And while they're getting all that contract money, I'm kind of getting a lot of it in the back end. I'm sure that
Sides of
happens.
the aisle, contributing to
I'm
their
sure it doesn't
campaigns,
happen. What am I talking
bringing
about?
them out to show them how great their weapons are, doing whatever they can to make sure that the money keeps flowing to their companies.
I mean,
These
it's
companies also
the
benefit
thing with capitalism,
from
I
the
guess,
infamous
but
revolving door.
Again, that monopoly is going to be it's going to be a pretty big
The revolving
player
door
in
is
that.
not a literal door. It's a metaphorical door between the Pentagon and the defense corporations, which allows top military leaders like Jim Mattis to serve in the military for decades, retire as a general, and then join the board of General Dynamics, a defense contractor, only to pass through the proverbial door to become the Secretary of Defense under Trump. After which, he passes through the door again
Revolving
to go
door.
back onto the board of General Dynamics, bringing with
And
him all of his insider knowledge and
going after
government
Mad Dog.
contacts and influence. And no, this is not just Jim Mattis. This is a very normal thing that people do here in DC. One analysis found that
Never
in
seen the
2022,
revolving door
top
thing. That's
defense
kinda cool.
companies hired 672 employees directly out of the Pentagon to work as lobbyists, board members, and executives.
I mean,
Go check my sources.
at the same time, you kind of know, how a lot of those systems work, and you also can get people who can forecast what the military is looking at as far as, here are these gaps of equipments that we are going to need to fill. So there's going to be some research and development coming down the pipeline for these specific things. So it definitely does make a lot of sense if that's kind of how they're doing
If
that.
you want to read more about this. I mean, yes, the revolving door is metaphorical, but it's also pretty physical and literal. I drive on this freeway all the time, and I'm always struck at how close all of this is. Over here is
my
the
gosh.
Pentagon, and over here are all
Been
the
there
defense
many a time.
contractors in an area of town literally called Pentagon City.
If there's someone working in government who is deciding on contracts and they have a conversation with someone who's going to receive that contract, the person in the firm can promise a good high-paying job after that government official is out of government. And so the government official then has an incentive to give a generous contract to the contractor because they know they're getting this kind of quid pro quo. They're going to get a high-paying job after they leave government.
And to add insult to injury,
Yeah, I mean, it
here,
makes sense.
some of the lawmakers
And-
who approve the Pentagon's budget own stocks in the defense contracting companies. Like, the lawmakers get
I think people have
richer
known this for a while,
if
but it's
we
like,
spend more money on.
oh, there it goes again. But it's also like, how much can the general public do, especially if a lot of it isn't necessarily illegal, if it's just kind of like immoral or whatnot. I think that's kind of a bigger thing to look at.
Spend more money on defense. No. Why do we do this? Like, this is like classic, basic, simple. Like, no, conflict of interest. We should not do this. This is not a thing we should do. But actually owning stocks in these companies is not the biggest way, I think, that our lawmakers are influenced by defense contractors. There's something more subtle going on here that I think is actually the best explanation. And it has to do with this excellent map. This map was assembled by an Air Force veteran and analyst named Christian Sorensen. This map makes it easy to see how contractors intentionally allocate their operations all across the country, spanning dozens of states and political districts. Building all of this stuff means jobs, which people like. So lawmakers are incentivized to keep these contractors making stuff in their district, to provide jobs for their people so they can keep getting elected. It's honestly brilliant. It's smart. This is political
Interesting,
engineering.
okay.
You can see it very clearly with lawmakers like Roger Wicker, a senator from the state of Mississippi. Senator Wicker is a member of the U.S. Senate Committee on Armed Services, which plays a huge role in giving taxpayer money to the Pentagon, which in turn feeds the bottom line of the contractors. Wicker loves the military. You often hear him advocating that we should spend way more on the military.
We need, in the United States, to spend more on defense. It's a necessity.
He writes op-eds in the New York Times calling for more shipbuilding. And when you look at his state, you realize,
blueprint.
of course he does. The largest employer in Mississippi is this naval shipyard run by a defense contractor named Huntington Ingalls, which means more
Damn.
jobs and economic stimulus for Wicker's people in
Connected
his
those
state,
dots
which
real
means
quick.
a better likelihood of being reelected. Now, these defense contractors know that Senator Wicker is an important part of their bottom line, so they contribute huge amounts of money to his campaign to make sure he gets reelected. It's this
Low-key,
virtuous
visiting a
cycle
shipyard
between
would be so
Senator
cool.
Wicker and the defense contractors that results in us spending more money on things that maybe we don't need to. Senator Wicker's job is to represent the American people. He sits on a committee that is...
I mean, I can't think how many workers it takes to build a ship. I mean, just having been in a ship, I'm like mind blown. I'm like, how do you even start building these things? There's just so much happening and so much going on. It'd be really interesting to kind of see how many people go into building just like one ship specifically.
Supposed to be looking at our national security as a whole.
Let
And
alone
yet,
like the
thanks to
weapons
strategy
and stuff
of these
on them.
for-profit defense contractors, this lawmaker has way too much incentive to advocate for more military spending, which is exactly what he does. My issue here is less with Senator Wicker or Congressman Mike Rogers, who has the same thing, sits on a committee, gives a bunch of money to the Pentagon, has a state where billions of dollars of defense contract money comes into, takes tons of money from defense contractors for his campaign, gets reelected, continues to approve more money for the Pentagon, etc. My issue is with the system that allows this to happen, that allows the money from our military
I
spending.
mean, yeah, you think of
to be
someone just in the
used
state
to influence our
seeing
lawmakers
all
into
these
more
jobs
military spending.
opening.
It's so clearly a conflict
Sounds
of
pretty
interest.
good.
And it is this system that has created an environment where there is very little political pushback to the endless ratcheting up of our military budget.
You know, no congressperson wants to be the person who loses jobs in their district. Nobody wants to be the one known as shutting down a plant and people
I
becoming
want to see how much the
unemployed.
spending
And
has
so
increased
Lockheed
or
can
whatnot
say,
over the years.
we have to have increased funding of this contract, or
Aside
we will
from like
lose
inflation
jobs.
and stuff.
And
if
so
it's
that
gone up
idea that
much.
jobs are essential, the Department of Defense spending is essential, really gives the contractor political power.
Let me make one point clear.
This is going to
which
be an
that
interesting topic
this isn't
here.
all corporate lobbying that contributes to the U.S. spending so much on the military. That would be too lazy of an explanation. We live in a world where there's a well-documented paradox that explains that strong militaries are actually the key ingredient to avoiding conflict, in deterring an enemy from
That's the thing, the
attacking,
deterrence is
keeping a
like,
balance between big
do you really want to
militaries
work
so that no one attacks.
against a military
Maybe someday we won't need military
that spends like,
even
or a country
close
that
to the
spends
size
half
that
of
we
their
have today.
GDP
But it
on their
appears that
defense?
in today's world we still do need big militaries with credible threats to avoid the age-old human curse of war. And yet on the other
I mean, the way that I think about it is like, if you had this kind of spending coming from like Russia, if Russia had this much money on, you know, to spend on their defense, that's going to be a pretty scary thing, especially considering kind of their politics and how they do things, their diplomacy, just invading countries kind of willy-nilly. And there's, of course, a lot of global pushback. But even still, if they had that kind of money going to their military, that's going to be a very formidable thing. And there's going to be a lot of countries trying to do what they can to kind of oppose that. Same thing with China. Again, there's a lot of things that we've seen with China, kind of them trying to push their influence, taking it by force, kind of just being a bully in like the South China Sea and stuff specifically. But there's a lot of things that we're seeing. And if you had this kind of money going to a lot of these other countries, North Korea, another good example, they're going to use that for very, very negative things. On a global scale, they're going to be very selfish and greedy and kind of use that for their own personal gain. And you can see a lot of the stuff that the U.S. military does is really kind of just trying to push back against those bullies, or, you know, again, provide like humanitarian aid, or kind of bolster countries that don't necessarily have as much defense spending. Even things like NATO and whatnot. A lot of people will have a lot of stuff to say about NATO. But again, when you have countries like Russia who are kind of just using that as an example to invade other countries, then it kind of just goes to show what their intentions really are.
age-old human curse of war. And yet on the other side of that paradox is the fact that if you grow your military, you force your adversary to do the same, to keep pace with you. The US and the Soviet Union did that for decades during the Cold War, each ratcheting up their military until suddenly both sides had over 10,000 nuclear warheads.
Yeah, I would say hella
That is
nukes.
madness. It diverges
We've
from the
downsized
rational,
a lot.
and yet it's the logical result when we decide that the main solution to beating our rivals is to just make more
That's
weapons.
so cool to see those
As
factories.
the US spends more, Russia, China, other countries are spending more. If you look at the discretionary budget, about 50% of that goes to the Department of Defense, and only 1 or 2% of that goes to the Department of State. You can see where our priorities are. A show of force is really the first foreign policy of the US.
For this one, the explanation is
Interesting.
easy. Diplomacy is hard and complicated and long. It doesn't make leaders feel as powerful and secure as having a big military does. And no one's getting rich off diplomacy. And yet diplomacy, international law and organizations, treaties, cooperation,
Interesting.
that is how we solve our differences. That is how we have learned to live peacefully on this globe. The fact is, no one ever achieved sustainable peace by spending more on their military. And
I mean, you have to think, if we stopped spending all this money, we would be outpaced very, very quickly by, like, you know, China and stuff. And then once that happens, the second that happens, and it's very clear and apparent, then there's going to be a lot of very negative things happening. That's going to roll over into diplomacy very quickly.
finally, we have to remember that while we pour so much into our military, that is money
As crappy
that
as it is,
can't
obviously.
be spent elsewhere.
If we increase defense spending, that necessarily has to mean something else decreases. Bigger piece of the pie for defense, smaller piece of the pie for other things. And those other things might be healthcare, education, climate change, and so on. And then we can also think of this notion of security. What actually makes us secure? Does spending more on defense make us more secure? If you look at other sources of security, you know, having good roads and bridges, having safe drinking water, these are all things that Americans need investment in to be safe, to be healthy. So
Yeah, so we're talking about a lot of, like, internal security stuff. And of course, like, I would love if, you know, all the roads were perfect and, you know, you didn't have to pay for healthcare and whatnot. But I think comparing them is very difficult. It's kind of like an apples to oranges kind of thing when you're talking about, like, externally versus, like, internal security and stuff. I'd like to see a lot of proposals that people have as far as, okay, here's this useless military program. Let's take this money and give it to, you know, healthcare or colleges or roads or hospitals, what have you.
economically secure, people have jobs that they can go to, funding for college. Those are all sources of security as well. So it's not just military security we need to think of when we think of the federal budget.
I deeply respect the men and women who work and serve the country in the military. But I think that our laws and norms around how much money we give to the military prevents us from assessing this situation clearly. The system we have incentivizes the wrong priorities. Priorities that have a lot more to do with profit margins of companies and the electability of lawmakers. All of this setting us on a path of infinite escalation that risks ending in disaster.
There's also...
Hey, thanks for watching, everyone. If you haven't checked out Search Party, our other channel run by Sam Ellis, it is geopolitics and...
I haven't, actually. I'll definitely go and check that out and subscribe. I'll put his video in the description. Definitely go and check out his channel. He's got a lot of really incredible stuff. And he also allows me to react to his stuff, which I appreciate. So, yeah, if you're watching for whatever reason, I appreciate you. Yeah, so there's also a few other things, like anecdotally. I've talked to a lot of other service members from other countries, and hearing, like, the benefits compared to what the U.S. military gets, like service members, veterans, or retirees, it's pretty shocking. Like, again, you can get out of the military, you can collect disability, you can get like $4,000 a month for the rest of your life off of just disability alone. And if you're a retiree, you can get your retirement as well as disability. So, and that's pretty incredible to think, like, the amount of wear and tear that you can get in the military, stuff that you just wouldn't get in other job fields. It's pretty awesome to have that at your disposal, kind of have that security. Once you get out of the military, you can still be kind of well taken care of. Now, the VA, how they kind of run that's a whole nother thing. But yeah, as far as having those benefits, a lot of other countries don't even have that. Like, you won't even get any disability or anything. And that was kind of like, it just kind of blew my mind. I don't know why it blew my mind. I guess just kind of being stuck in my echo chamber of just the U.S. military, you kind of have expectations of what other militaries are like or how other countries prioritize their service members or veterans. Yeah, you get kind of jaded, I guess. So that's just another interesting thing that I've kind of picked up on. Okay, very interesting video. Again, this kind of rolled a lot more into the political realm, which I'm not the most knowledgeable when it comes to politics. I'll go ahead and say that. So my opinions might not necessarily be the most informed. So I'll kind of just go off of anecdotes for the most part, but also kind of being in the U.S. military, there's only so much I can say as far as like politics and kind of what my opinion is on a kind of public forum like this. But definitely interesting. I'd love to hear your guys' opinions as far as things that we've covered in this video. Again, it's the U.S. military. Everybody kind of knows there's a lot of money going into it, but it's kind of me being in the U.S. military. It's awesome. I mean, it provides for my family, gives my family medical care. It covers our moving expenses, dental, and even getting glasses, surgeries like laser eye surgery that gets covered. There's a lot of things, schools. There's a lot of things that have really kind of helped me out. But also kind of just talking about like my family growing up, we didn't have like a whole lot of money, and to go into the real world, basically, I wasn't able to afford college. That was not going to happen. But to be able to join the military, get college for free, and then also just kind of spend the last 12 years, a little over 12 years, kind of putting myself in a position where I can make enough to kind of, provide for my family, and, do it comfortably. That's a pretty awesome thing to be able to kind of have that. And, you can say it takes advantage of people who don't have many opportunities. I see it very much as the opposite, because I didn't have any opportunities and now I have plenty of them. So, and then you can kind of use that to move into the civilian world and kind of just be useful, because I was not going to be very useful. I didn't have a whole lot of skills. Wasn't going to be going to college. I would have like just kind of picked one skill and hopefully just like grown on that. But now I can kind of be versatile in where I shift myself after the military. Just kind of anecdotally, that's kind of my perspective. But again, yeah, there's definitely a lot of you can imagine this corruption anywhere. There's going to be a lot of people who are kind of lining their pockets, taking advantage of certain things. But when I look at other militaries, especially some more like third world countries, that corruption is it's completely rampant. It's like insane. You can get away with a lot of things. Yeah, let me know what your guys' thoughts are on this video. Definitely covered a lot of things, but I'd love to hear your perspectives, especially people who aren't in the U.S. military or just from the U.S. at all, kind of what those metrics sound like, because he did a lot of comparison, and for me, it's kind of harder for me to appreciate it, I guess. But hopefully you guys enjoyed. That is it for this video. I'll see you on the next one.